Hi, South by Southwest Education. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you. My name is Felix, and I'm a strategy director at Artifact. We are a responsible strategy and design firm, which means that whether we are creating a toolkit to help educators think about ways to implement competence-based learning, or a digital community for teachers to share teaching tricks and tips, or a learning education platform to help young adults and preteens build their digital literacy skills and learn about algorithmic bias. What really drives all of our work is that we always try to design with the communities of intended use and think really broadly about their context and environment. And today I'm so excited to be joined by two of our amazing partners, Elise Adoll from National Writing Project, as well as Lucas Fenrick from Arizona State University, to talk about digital inclusion in digital education. To start out with, I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves by sharing your name, your pronoun, as well as a little bit about your role in organization. And to really help kick things off, also share one moment of joy in relation to an education experience that you've encountered in the past year. So I can go ahead and get started. Once again, my name is Felix Chang. I'm a strategy director at Artifact, and I'm also a community involvement commissioner with the city of Seattle, advising the city on ways to advance equitable community engagement. And obviously, it's been really hard for everyone in quarantine and lockdown, but one moment of joy that I've witnessed in attending community meetings at senior centers, as well as reading online about, are the emergence of digital pen pal programs, where a lot of seniors are actually connecting with really young kids. And this has been great for, I think, the kids to develop their writing skills. And it's also been really nice for the seniors to be able to share their wisdom and feel social connection and really build that social connection with others in a time when that's hard. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Elise.
Hey everyone, I'm Elise Adoll, and I'm the executive director at the National Writing Project, a network of educators who help each other teach writing, K through university. And I guess one of the things about last year that was exciting, despite everything that was so hard, was because there was so much participation of young people in their learning online. It was possible to see amazing student work from young people who might have only been sharing it in their classroom or in a face-to-face situation. And now it was out online. So I had a year where I got to see more young people across the nation sharing great work that they were doing than probably any other time. That would be my moment of joy.
That's really exciting to hear, Elise. Thanks for sharing. And next up, we'll have Lucas introduce himself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Lucas Fenrick. I'm the director of the Learning Enterprise at ASU, which is our third arm of the university focused on creating ubiquitous access to educational and economic opportunity for everybody. One moment of joy for me has been seeing the growth of our earned admissions program here. And to give a little context to that, we have these universal learner courses, which are MOOCs, and students pay $25 up front and then $400 on the back end if they pass. If they pass 4 or 8 of those, depending on their age, they're with a 2.75 GPA, they're automatically admitted to ASU, no questions asked. Doesn't matter what their high school GPA was or if they had any bad experiences. This last year, I'm so proud to say that we admitted almost 1,300 students who were previously inadmissible to the university. And the best part about it is that those students are doing better than our traditionally admitted students, proving a new way to admit students to a university.
That's amazing. Wow. I wish that program was available to me in school. Thanks so much for sharing. Awesome. Well, we're so excited to have Lucas and Elise with us today to talk about how we can all collectively build inclusion into the digital education experiences that we're creating. Obviously, most learning that's taking place right now is online. So it's really important as we have transitioned online to think about how we're not leaving certain communities behind or causing unintentional harm. And so today we'll walk you through 3 strategies. First, thinking about how we can align and understand stakeholders across our educational systems to understand their needs and really account for them and include them and engage them. Then discovering how we can build intentionally toward positive, inclusive, and equitable outcomes while mitigating unintended consequences and harm. And then third, thinking about how we can learn to contextualize programs for students' different histories, learning styles, as well as goals. So to start out with, I'd love to have Elise go ahead and share with us her experiences at National Writing Project and how it relates to inclusion and alignment across the education spectrum.
Well, actually, there are so many, for every educator, there are so many levels and so many ways to talk about inclusion. It's a major concern for all of us in our teaching lives, in building institutions. But I'd like to refer to actually some of the work that you all were able to help us do as we're thinking about including a broader array of teachers in the kinds of supports that the National Writing Project gives, if that's okay. Felix will talk about this project with you all. First, a little background. There may be folks who are watching this who know the National Writing Project, but the National Writing Project is a network that actually started in 1974. We've been around a while at the University of California, Berkeley. And it is a network of educators, K through university and across the curriculum, who think a lot about teaching writing, using writing in science or across the fields, and really put that at the center of their teaching. And back in 1974, we were a network that operated out of local writing project sites. There's 175 of them at universities across the country, one at ASU, by the way, Lucas. And before, at that point, networks and sites did not necessarily mean internet networks and websites. So this is before all of that. And so our effort to reach as many of our colleagues as possible in order to improve the teaching of writing and support them to work with all their students was a very human-driven one, driven by selecting and identifying great teacher leaders at all those grades and having them work with their colleagues. That still is something that we do out of those 175 writing project sites. And we have a lot of them. We have about 100,000 teacher leaders around the nation leading professional development, et cetera. But now with the opportunities afforded to us by digital tools, we can think about that whole question of how they work and how they lead differently. For a long time in our organization, we use the development of digital tools to support our teacher leaders to do that human job of working with their colleagues. We built a pretty extensive set of digital learning opportunities and tools tilted toward those leaders. Well, now we're thinking about actually all the places where teachers are not able to access those opportunities. There isn't a writing project perhaps in their backyard, or there are other structures that keep them from participating in that very human opportunity. And how can we serve them? So part of our work, for example, with you all at Artifact was to begin to really understand that user base, who we understand a lot because they're teachers and we're a teacher organization, but strangely, maybe not enough because they are not our teacher leaders. And so in the idea of trying to build new communities for them, we had to overcome something that I think is really an important part of thinking about an inclusive environment. And that's how to push yourself when you know a lot about your population, but you don't nearly know enough. You ask different questions when you think you have a sense of the life and interests and possibilities and ways of participating for your target audience, but maybe you actually don't. So how do you put yourself into a learning mode where you can both draw on, but also really question your assumptions, hear directly from that population that you need to build with, not just for, but with, and do it in such a way that you can both own your knowledge, but be open to seeing it differently. And so we engaged with Artifact in a set of user studies that deliberately was providing us with some information from the kinds of teachers that we actually don't reach, to help us understand them, to help that put a bit of a box around our instincts for design, which are pretty well developed. And so it's hard to actually hold that in and to help us do that. And I think that that's an important thing that I would say about alignment. And then the last piece is, once you go through those user studies, once you learn things that will push your thinking, how do you actually create a learning culture with your current participants It could be your faculty, it could be your colleagues, it could be your organizational supports, your bosses down to your frontline folk, to actually be able to hear those new perspectives openly, again, without denigrating the deep expertise and knowledge that you might have, but being open to seeing your knowledge and experience differently, and maybe giving up and putting away some of the patterns that have made you great and efficient, but actually are part of the barriers that you might have in reaching new audiences.
Wow, that's amazing. And I really love the points you made about building with. I would love to circle back to those in the later part of our discussion. Thanks so much for sharing, Elise. I'll turn it over to Lucas to share with us about building.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to share a project as well that was connected with the Artifact team here. I worked with Eric, Tessa, and Amelia, and they were just fantastic. So to pull it back a bit, the pandemic really did unearth a lot of challenges that were happening in the digital learning space. We're seeing a lot of disparate outcomes for learners and for institutions across the country based on the amount of resources that they had, or maybe the preparation that they may have had in the digital space prior to the pandemic. The Gates Foundation had understood some of these things that were happening and really wanted to dive deeper into some of that work. So they funded our team here at ASU to really understand some of the institutions like ASU could do to help capacity for serving institutions and a lot of institutions across the country. So in 2020, our team worked with Artifact conceptualizing might be able to build a system where faculty procure some of the content that we had and then contextualize it for their own specific needs, or how high schools and nonprofit organizations could take the existing learning content and then get it in front of a wide audience of learners across the country, and maybe even co-brand some of that content so it felt like it was really useful for communities at the time. What the Artifact team really helped us unearth was the importance of getting our ducks in a row to engage in communities we were planning to serve. We had a lot of initial conversations with leads at MSIs and at other institutions, and it was really hard to start to conceptualize some solutions to the challenges that were faced with the really intangible kind of concepts that we were throwing out there. Once we really started to conceptualize the exact possible solutions that ASU could put forward, we worked with the Artifact team to construct some wireframes and even some collateral. And then when we had conversations with leaders at MSIs, we were able to get much more constructive feedback on specifically what they needed, and then adjust appropriately for a strategy to go forward in a way that building allowed us to get the feedback that we needed.
Thanks so much for sharing. And I love the theme between both of your projects where you were able to engage communities of youth in the creation process. And I think at Artifacts, that's one of the things we find is most powerful. It's not really sitting in a room and thinking, we know what's right. It's really people making decisions for themselves about what's most appropriate and what is most helpful for them. So that's really exciting to hear. Quickly diving into our third strategy, Contextualize, before we open it up for our general discussion. The third area that we wanted to chat about in relation to advancing inclusion in digital education is to contextualize information. And when we think about what that means in relation to design, it's often bringing information and bringing experiences to where students or learners or instructors are. And so there's many ways you can do that. From an interaction standpoint, artificial intelligence is really helpful when we're designing to personalize experiences. And one example we were fortunate to participate with was we partnered with the Gates Foundation to create Topeka, which is a digital writing platform that helps students build their writing capacity through staff and teacher-generated prompts. What Topeka does is, as students are writing, it actually provides suggestions based on word choice, as well as sentence structure and grammar in context of their work. And so they can decide for themselves how they can improve it and really look for areas to improve. And what this does is really assist teachers in their work by freeing up teachers' time to really focus on higher level concepts of learning, such as how to think critically about domains, how to think about style as you write, and also provide more individualized attention to students who might need it. And so providing information in the context of an experience where someone is able to really learn from it in the moment is a really powerful way to build inclusion and make people feel like they belong and are supported by an experience. Another aspect of providing context that's really helpful is thinking about time. And time is really helpful, especially for a lot of health learning experiences that we create. If you think, for instance, let's say someone is living with diabetes and they need to track their glucose levels and manage the insulin they're using or their diet. Thinking about time is not necessarily just in the current moment in time, what are my glucose levels? It's also thinking about what your glucose levels might have looked like in the past, how your past behaviors might have really shifted your current behaviors, and then what you're eating right now, or sort of how you're using insulin right now, how that might impact your glucose levels in the future. So thinking about time as a form of context is also one way to make people feel like they are really being seen and really felt and accounted for by an experience. And then finally, I think it's really important to think about ways that the environments, even in digital spaces that we create, are really able to help people feel like they belong. An example is a study I conducted looked at virtual reality learning classrooms, and it actually found that when students are in a virtual 3D classroom with an avatar tutor who is a male instructor, if the male instructor actually has their legs spread in a sexist body posture or man spreading, it actually causes female identifying students to learn math less effectively. So even small cues in an environment or the context of a digital learning platform can actually lead to differences in learning outcomes. So it's really important for us to think about, whether it is the branding guidelines that you're using, what are the color tones you're using? Are they, traditionally masculine or feminine identifying? Thinking about any cues that you have in your experience, they can actually make a really big difference in how effectively people learn and teach. So with that, I would love to once again transition over to our amazing panelists. And both of you mentioned really building with and really engaging communities. From your experience, I was wondering if you could share what are things that are really important to think about when building with? What makes building with successful, or what's important for people to keep in mind?
Elise.
I was wondering well, okay, I'll say some things. I think one of the things when I think of building with rather than building for, I think at the bottom of that is a question about whether the people we're thinking about, those users that we're thinking about them as consumers, or we're thinking of them as potential leaders within the space. In other words, when we think and we build with people, are we imagining them as potentially taking the most active role in the space? It could be in a digital learning classroom, where are we thinking about them merely as consuming students, or possibly as sharing the pulpit, in effect, of the classroom, leading parts of it, using the tools in order to educate their peers in a very leaderly way. In our case, we were looking at the question of how teachers who are younger, who are not necessarily into their careers and are looking for support and haven't necessarily found it connected with a writing project, could participate in this platform. And one of the key elements was to understand them not simply, and sometimes they like to present themselves this way, not simply as people who would consume ideas and consume teaching tips and benefit from teaching tips. They often talked about that's what they were looking for. But on the other hand, how would this platform or this experience be different if we imagine them also as contributors, as developers, as leaders of approaches to designs to teaching? How would they use these tools to actually be the leader and not just the getter of tips? And I think that we found in that an example, which I think is a metaphor or an analogy, let's say, for other kinds of experiences, that sometimes what your user might come in and say first they want from you, and they do actually want it from you, but it also might be the thing that limits their participation. And so being able to go with your users on a deep dive into what it would mean to fully participate in something, often gets a kind of second and third level response from people that can't be gotten in a focus group or a survey or a light touch, when people simply respond to you in the structure that they have in mind, again, for themselves as a user or consumer, that those people get to go on a journey too, to provide a kind of feedback and design expertise that is not necessarily top of mind for them, but can really shape the way that they express their needs and interests and work with you, so that in fact it is indeed a with. Everyone gets to the point where they can bring their best design self to the particular topic at hand. And that would be what I associate with that not for but with phrase.
I love that, Elise, and I feel like it's a very humble attitude. I feel like some product teams approach design as like, oh, we're building a product for users, and we can figure out what users' real problems are. But I really like your approach of, people are really creative, and if you work with them, they will point you to what works for them. I think that's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing. Lucas, love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I love that response, Elise. And I think I'll frame it a little more in like the iterative design process, but I think it's a really obvious answer, but I have an example for it. I think it's pretty obvious, but just listen to the communities that you're serving here, and then be prepared to make the sometimes really harsh or difficult changes that are earthed by that conversation. And so, an initial example, earned admissions, our first learner there, we had a Starbucks College Achievement Program, and if you work at Starbucks, you can get a free degree from ASU, but you still have to meet our admissions requirements. And we had some learners who were taking universal learner courses and getting a lot of college credits, but still weren't able to take advantage of the full program and get a degree at ASU. They reached out to us, and there's one in particular who reached out and sent a really long email to the dean of our online college. And we listened, and we worked with that student to really understand what the challenges were. And it was clear they really wanted to succeed and had the to do so. And so we made institutional changes and had to work with, across the university to really allow for an option like this to exist. Not listened and then been prepared to make those changes. The learner might not have had access to a university education like we were providing.
I think that's a great point. And I really like how you're able to actually practice flexibility. I think a lot of people talk about, being flexible and meeting people where they are, but I think that's an amazing example of where you met someone where they were based on their situation and experiences. That's amazing. I think another area that I would love to hear both of your thoughts about are in relation to digital education. Obviously, digital learning can promote opportunities for access as well as inclusion. And as we know, it could potentially exacerbate existing inequities based on access as well. As people who are both, really thoughtful about digital education, what's the key to really balancing that tension? And how can we work to catalyze digital education to make it something that is more inclusive and try to prevent it from being a barrier to access?
Lucas, you all have done so much on access. Do you want to start there? That's such a fundamental inclusion question.
Yeah, I think the way kind of frame hyper-focusing on tearing down those barriers to entry for learners and then trying to co-create the solutions with the communities that you're serving. One such example is, we call it ASU Local, and it is an online digital education that students in Los Angeles can receive. But we have a hub where learners can come and receive contextualized student success resources in their community, and then bring in leaders from the community to those resources as well. Acknowledging that we saw disparities really early on in the outcomes for some of our students of color, income students in the digital learning environment. Now we're seeing really high 90% plus success rates for these learners when we have the contextualized supports for them. But the barriers aren't there anymore.
That's really cool.
Obviously, especially during the last year of all times in K-12 education, in addition, we've been able to see the significance of just simple digital divide style access, which has all the dimensions that we know about, devices, bandwidth, but then an environment in which you can do a kind of work, which often happens in online education. Do you have space to concentrate? Can you control the sound level? And there's so many elements of it. So I feel like that's one area that people have learned so much about. But I guess I would then want to bring up another question, and that's sort of not the immediate issue of educational inequalities through digital education, but when digital education in a different way can actually promote or exacerbate a different kind of inequity. And this is one we worry a lot about as well. And we all do, I'm sure. And that's when different approaches to digital education, sometimes which track along issues of race and income level, actually promote a kind of, in one level, a kind of unleashing agency for young people, let's say. They're encouraged to follow interests. They're encouraged to figure out how tools can help them advance their thinking, how they can connect with mentors and peers, a kind of connected learning model through these tools, how they can use them for creative and exciting purposes, as well as these tools also providing them with the kind of foundational knowledge that everyone agrees young people should have. And another kind of setup actually limits the way that users can use and interact and participate with the tools. So they're spending as many minutes, perhaps as much bandwidth, perhaps as much screen time as any other learner, but they're not actually being engaged to either use the tools for their own creative purposes or visioning purposes. They're not being helped to follow interests or understand how the digital environment in general can help them follow those interests and take greater independence and agency. So the metrics about devices or connectivity may not tell us the truth about these different approaches or opportunities for learners to develop independence and agency. And we may not actually even see through traditional testing and assessment opportunities until down the road the difference that has made to create different kinds of persons who can function in different ways in a digital environment. So I think that's another question that we have to take on in terms of looking at equity across digital learning opportunities and environments.
Yeah, no, I think that's an amazing point in relation to equity. You know, what does a digital experience actually mean for a student or a learner? And I think it's really good to point out that what we traditionally measure might not be the best way to assess how inclusive we're being or how what we're doing, to your point. I think that's a really great point. Well, we're getting close to time. So in wrapping, I did want to ask one more question, which is, let's say you are giving advice to any educator or any person building a digital learning experience, and you want to encourage them to be more inclusive. What is one commitment they should make to being more inclusive that they can take and immediately, either in their work or with their team? What's one thing they should do tomorrow and really work to be more inclusive?
Go ahead, Elise.
I was just thinking, we've spoken a little before about the importance of listening, and I think most people would say that open listening for everybody in a space is central to moving toward more inclusive practices. And so one thing that occurred to me is to build on that and to encourage a norm, especially for people with expertise in any domain or area, to turn off the yes, but. I think one of the problems that we often have is that if we're in institutions or settings and we want to make them more inclusive, we actually almost know too much about them. So it's easy to say, oh, that's a good idea. Yes, but down the road, it would cause this person, this kind, and then the finance, and we can see all the challenges with almost anything that someone is suggesting or saying before it even sort of leaves their mouth. And it's very hard to turn that off in one's brain. So I would say one thing we can all do is enter these conversations with a commitment to turning off the yes, but.
I love that. Yes, and not yes, but. Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, no, Lucas, what about you?
As you were answering, I was writing down listen, and I'm right there with you on it's so critical that we just need to be engaging the people that we're supposed to be serving earlier in the process and throughout the entire experiences. And then, as I was saying earlier, I think it's so critical that we have to be prepared for those changes through that process. Often it's a really common exercise to go ahead and listen to communities and then go ahead and just do what you were going anyway without those changes. Trying to incorporate a lot of the feedback that you receive and adjusting the path that you may have already set on, I think is really, really difficult, but the most important work that we can be doing.
That makes absolute sense. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. This has been amazing to learn from you both and also to partner with you on our engagement. We really would love to continue the conversation. So if you have any further questions or thoughts for our panelists, feel free to reach out. Their contact information is listed here. And I wanted to take this time once again so much for thanking Elise and Lucas for joining us and sharing your amazing perspectives.
Felix, thank you.